So today's speaker is Dr. Stephen Aguilar, who's an associate professor of education and educational psychology, concentration at the USC Rossier School of Education. His research focuses on investigating how educational technologies, both emerging and established, influence teaching, learning, and motivation. It studies the impact of generative AI in education settings, the digital equity gap, and learning analytics applications. And currently is the co-lead in USC's new Center for Generative AI and Society's efforts to understand when and how generative AI is used by students and instructors in post-secondary settings. So please give a big hand for our guest, Dr. Aguilar.
Thanks for having me. So yeah, I am an educational psychologist by training, but I do a lot of work in ed tech, so that's what I'm going to get into today. So I always like to start my talks with things that people can let simmer throughout the talk. So I want to start with these two images. The first here is, if you remember during the Olympics, there was a bit of a scandal here when Gemini had this advertisement where they wanted, the father wanted Gemini to help the daughter write a letter to their idol, which was a runner. And then there was some backlash, like, why would you want your kid to not learn how to write? Why wouldn't you use something else? And then there was a different advertisement by Microsoft, which starts with, I'll read it in white, but can I turn 150 pages into a 5-minute presentation before today's meeting? And this sort of gets at the core of why we're here and why we're thinking about AI in education and what it is that, like, these core questions of when should we use it, who should use it, and what are the implications for its use? And for us, specifically in higher education, it deals with sort of the question mark. We are that red arrow that connects education to workforce and connects education to how people live. So we need to be thinking about how we incorporate AI into our own spaces. The challenge, though, is that whenever there is a new technology, there is, if folks are familiar, this is the Gartner hype cycle for an emerging technology. So it's basically a way to visualize what happens when there's something new that emerges and that creates this inflection point. So you see here the visibility and time is on the X, the visibility is on the Y. So AI became really visible a couple of years ago. So you see how that spikes up. And one of the things that happens whenever a new technology emerges is we have a lot of expectations for what it can do, right? So AI, even if you think about it in conversations with your colleagues, it's still this nebulous thing that has to be sort of instantiated into a product before we even know what it is. And because of that, there are these inflated expectations in terms of what it can do. But what ends up happening always whenever there's a new technology that emerges is that we eventually get to this trough of disillusionment where we're like, it can't actually solve all of our problems. It probably can't solve many of them. And then eventually we figure out what to do with it. And eventually we get to that plateau of productivity. So that's what we're experiencing right now. And I argue that we're still sort of here in this plateau of peak of inflated expectations when it comes to Gen AI. So it's a new technology trigger. And there was there's been a lot of ways that this has been expressed out in the world, right? There's been LA Unified School District's very public failure at this point of trying to create their own AI chatbot. There's been sort of these failures among tech companies to sort of find that right tone for their marketing. There's been other challenges. But before I get into any of that and why that matters for any of us, I want to sort of take a step back and define what AI is so that we at least have a common vocabulary in terms of this discussion and questions that we have. So there are at least 3 different ways that we can think about AI and when it gets expressed out in the world. There's narrow AI, or what's known as weak AI. There's general AI or strong AI. And then there's this idea of a super intelligent AI. So narrow AI is whenever anyone out in the world says, hey, I'm building an AI technology, or an ed tech startup comes and says, hey, you need to look at my product, that's generally what they're talking about. That's what exists right now, currently out in the world, is this idea of narrow AI that it's narrow because it can perform these narrow tasks really well. So for all of us who have iPhones and it uses facial recognition to unlock itself, that's a very narrow task that does very well. So that's a version of AI. Now, we could take a step back and say, well, it's actually like a bunch of machine learning that gets trained on a bunch of faces, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm sort of adopting the language of just calling that AI now. That seems to be what folks are doing. it operates in these limited contexts. And most of the time, whenever you hear people talk about AI, they're talking about narrow AI. And we use it every day. There's this idea of a general or strong AI. So when we're thinking about this idea of AI that can think in human-like ways, learn in human-like ways, apply knowledge in different contexts, that's this idea of general AI. And I created this sort of little scene here of what it would look like in the potential future, where you're playing with like an actual agent, like an AI person who has fashion sense, who is able to interact with you socially, who's playing a game, but is playing it incorrectly. It has judgments, its own independent judgments. It essentially has agency, right? And that's what general AI is. Think of another human being, except they're not human, they're AI, right? That's this idea of what general or strong AI is. But it doesn't actually currently exist except in the popular imagination and in literature and movies. So whenever folks are worried about this, they're worried about something that's not real at this point. And then there is super intelligent or AI, which is the fear that folks have often. It goes beyond human intelligence. It's not just a peer, but it can do things better than we can, faster than we can. It's more creative. It's wise. It solves problems. So think about like an AI overseer or someone that's sort of able to do everything that we can do, but better. Again, this doesn't actually exist, so it's not something that at least we should currently worry about. Maybe in a few decades, it's something that could emerge, but for now, when we're having a conversation about AI in education, it's not something that we need to actually concern ourselves with. And what we're actually talking about specifically when we're thinking about AI in education, we're often actually talking about this idea of large language models and what they have enabled us to do and new ways of thinking about how humans express themselves and how we often conceive of language in general. So I'll start here by sort of getting, hopefully you guys to participate. So if you can fill in the blanks for me. So roses are red, violets are, and I would say knock, knock. Right, so, and then if I ask you now a question, what can you make with the following ingredients that you see on the screen here?
Yeah.
Pasta, dinner, right? Lots of different answers. Spaghetti is definitely one thing that you can make with some of these things. It obviously depends on the pasta, depends on the sauce, right? But it's some sort of a food and dinner dish that is sort of at least somewhat Italian, right? That's the idea. Now, large language models do the same thing that you all just did, except they do it at scale and they do it with language. So when we're thinking about large language models, what we're really saying is that they're models that have studied millions of recipes, just to take this cooking analogy further. They've seen all the cooking shows. They've seen countless chefs cook. And with this information, they understand the patterns of what food is, and they can replicate those patterns based on questions we ask, right? So it's this idea of pattern recognition and pattern generation. It just happens that those patterns are linguistic patterns as opposed to other sorts of patterns. So given a set of words or a prompt, right, when you're thinking about prompt engineering and the prompts that are happening, that large language model, which in this case is a chef, can combine words, which are the ingredients, into plausible combinations of words, which are recipes. But importantly, the large language model does not understand what it's doing. It's merely using data to replicate patterns that it sees. So that's the key distinction here and why we're still in this world of narrow AI as opposed to more general AI, because that issue of understanding isn't there. It's not agentic in the way that we think of human agency. It's just replicating patterns. Now, if you want a sort of more technical explanation, and one of the ways that you can think of large language models is that they handle sequential data. And all language is, if we really pare it down, it's sequential data. When I write a sentence out, it has a structure that's ordered, and that order can actually be understood as relationships, as when, like if I'm not speaking grammatically or writing in a way that isn't grammatical, you understand that because there's something wrong about the order or the structure of what I'm writing. So large language models do this, but instead they use massive data sets to understand the sequential ordering of our words so that they can predict what comes next, right? It's a slightly more technical definition, but I'm not in the weeds here, right? The idea here is to just get you to see data or text as data and to help us understand that when large language models are generating text, that's effectively what they're doing. So what might go wrong with this approach, right? There are obviously large language models are predicated on this idea that text is data, it understands patterns given enough words, and it can generate new words. But there are a number of things that might go wrong. So I'll read this, and then folks I can read faster and I can speak and read ahead. This is a conversation with ChatGPT. So how many R's are in the word strawberry? The word strawberry has 2 R's. No, it's 3. Actually, strawberry has 2 R's. The spelling is Strawberry. Count them again slowly. Sure, let's count them. Strawberry. There are indeed 2 R's in strawberry. And then they emphasize the R's in strawberry. You're right, strawberry does have 3 when you break it down like strawberry. Thanks for pointing that out. There's no way to break it down so that is just how you spell it. I apologize, you are correct that strawberry is spelled with 2 R's. So despite all of that prompting, the large language model still got it wrong. And there's a reason for that I'll get into in a second. Here's another sort of more visible example that folks might have seen. So this was when Gemini first came out. How can I make cheese on my pizza not slide off? So there are some strategies here. Let it cool, use less sauce, add cheese to the sauce, shred your own cheese. But importantly, you can also try adding 1/8 cup of elmer's to the sauce for extra tackiness. Right. So the reason that this is happening is because it's just the way that the models are trained, right? So there was when people dug into why this was a plausible answer, was because it actually got this answer from Reddit. Right, Reddit, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's just a board where people post whatever they want anonymously. They have discussions. There are subreddits for certain communities. But when you're training your data, or when you're training your model on this data, this probably was a popular answer, but it might have been popular because it was funny, or because you don't know how folks are actually, what they're attributing to this answer. So when you're training a model on public data, these are some of the results that you might get. So again, large language models are predicated on the data they have, meaning that a lot of data, but where's it from? That's one of the questions that we should ask ourselves when we're thinking about large language models and their use and the products that are built on top of any large language model. Who wrote the training data, or was that training, where did it come from, right? Was it from Reddit? And this has particular implications for us who are educators, because often we're sort of in this, and I'll get into this towards the end of my talk, we're sort of at this inflection point where we are actually writing data for companies that will then use it to actually create new products. So I want to move us away from thinking about generative AI as sort of this panacea of solutions for all the problems that we have in education. And I'm not saying that those of us here in the room see it that way, but it's the common discourse. And sometimes it's how our students see it. So we need to break past that. So I have a couple of tools that I want to introduce, or maybe reintroduce to folks in the room, so they could think about AI differently and really think about any educational technology differently. So first, I have 2 degrees in philosophy for those of you who are curious. So I think a lot about Martin Heidegger's Being in Time, and specifically this idea that he introduced, which was a lot about tools. So one of the core theses in that work was this idea of seeing how human beings are our ontology through our use of tools. So one of the distinctions that he introduced was this idea of a tool that's ready to hand. So I have examples here of just, one's a puppet, but it's still a good example of tools, and how when we know how to use a tool incredibly well, it's actually an extension of how we operate out in the world. So think of any tool that you have, and it doesn't have to be a tool for work. It can be like the car you drove in on, or it could be a tool that you're using outside to do yard work. It could be a hammer, for example. Once you know deeply how to use that tool, you cease to see that tool as a tool. It just becomes an extension of yourself, an extension of the work that you're doing. And that is an important distinction for understanding educational technologies. Alternatively, there are tools that are present at hand. So tools that are salient and noticeable and not extension. So does anyone have a guess in terms of what this thing is here on the screen? No one's ever gotten it right, so I'm maybe you all.
Kind of a toy.
A toy? What kind of toy? No, but what's toy-like about it? It's interesting.
I don't know, it's some kind of a game people play.
Okay, so you see, like, potentially you're attributing, like, looking at the handle and like someone's the holes. Okay, it's got holes in it. Yeah, so we're now, because this is something that we haven't ever seen before, we start to notice design element, right? It's got a handle, it's got holes. I've gotten a fake leg before, which is, I mean, I guess, but it wouldn't be a very good. So it's actually an apple butter pattern. So if you've never made apple butter, you wouldn't know what this is. I've never made it. But the idea here is that if you're making apple butter, you constantly have to turn it. Otherwise, it'll scorch at the bottom, right? So now you constantly have to keep it from burning as it cooks down. You sort of understand why it has holes because it's very viscous. So the apple butter has to go through it. It's got a long handle because if it's a big pot, you don't want to be that close to it. So now that we all know what this is, we could probably all pick one up and marginally use it. Maybe our apple butter recipe isn't great, but we can at least manipulate the tool. So now we've moved from this tool being present at hand, or a tool that we just notice, but we don't know what it's for. Now it could be potentially ready to hand. So this is an important distinction because tools that are ready to hand, we can just use. Tools that are present at hand, we know that they're there, we know that they're tools, but we might not exactly know how to use them. So I argue that when we're thinking about AI in education, we're sort of oscillating between these two ideas. We all know how to use a chat interface, largely because we've been texting, or maybe we use like AOL Instant Messenger. That interface sort of makes sense to us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the AI affordances are as clear. So now I'll move on to sort of a different tool that I think is important, which is this idea of perceived affordances. So the idea of a design affordance is basically this picture. This is probably the best example I have. Whenever you're using a door, how it's designed suggests how it might be used, right? If it's got this push plate, you probably will go and try to push it. If it's got a pull handle, you will likely want to pull it towards you. That's a deliberate design decision by the person who designed the door because it suggests its use to us. But sometimes those things break, right? Sometimes the design affordance isn't actually what's possible, right? So this is a candy store in Ann Arbor where they just, for some reason, they had two of the same handle on either side of the door, and I would do it, and I would constantly see people just try to yank that door towards them because that's what that handle suggests to you, that you want to pull it towards you. So much so that they actually had to put a sign that says, "Just push it. I'm sorry for the handle. Just push the door." So again, this is sort of when the affordance sort of breaks. I argue that when we're thinking about our digital tools, they also have these perceived affordances. They suggest their use to us, which is why, again, ChatGPT is an intuitive tool because it's the chat interface that suggests its affordance. I see a box, I can type questions, I get an answer. That loop is something that we're familiar with and that we can interact with. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the entire affordance of the technology. And the reason for that is we all know, if we've played sort of with ChatGPT or any other generative AI tools, that what you type matters and will sort of shape the answer that you get. So the perceived affordances aren't nearly as clear. It's not that I type a question, I get the answer I want. I now have to think about what sort of question am I posing? What sort of thing am I asking of the generative AI technology to give me? Because that will shape my answer. So the perceived affordances are a little bit more hidden, but we can still see the edges of them. And finally, I want to discuss this idea of a socio-technical system. So the socio-technical system is effectively the technology that you're using, the social context where it operates, and the people who are actually operating it. So my example for this is driving. Not because I'm from California, but that is why I thought of it. It's because I think it's a pretty good way of thinking about the socio-technical system. So when we think about driving, we think about the car that we're using, the road that we're on, and the person who's actually driving them. We can think about impoverished versions of that experience, where the car that we're driving is not a good car, the roads that we're on are not good roads, and the person driving is not a competent or perhaps a new driver. And we can sort of combine these together, right? We can think of a new car on a crappy road with a new driver. used car on a good road with a crappy driver. Or a really good driver using this car on a good road, that experience is probably fine. Maybe not great, but it would, you're not unsafe. So when you're thinking about how technologies integrate into their environments, that's the socio-technical system. And when we're thinking about the socio-technical system in that way, it suggests a few questions that we might want to answer. Who is AI for? What are its core benefits? And what are its core downsides? So when we're thinking about education, we think about students. Who is AI? They should use AI, but when should they use AI? How should they use AI? When we're thinking about instructors, what constitutes safe use? What are our potential policies that we need to set for ourselves and for our students when we're deciding that they should or should not use a thing? When we're thinking about staff, so for the administrators in the room, some questions we might ask are, how might work be improved? What are the costs, if any, of using AI? And I'll get into each of these now. So for students, one of the things that we did at the center was we asked college students, we effectively created an assignment for them that used AI. This was last year in the fall, where students were asked to write basically a letter to a job. And they were given sort of the call of the job. And this was for our Writing 150. It's an introductory writing course. Every student has to take it. It has sort of disciplinary focus, like foci, like sometimes it'll be like an engineering section versus like a humanities section. And we asked them to create this assignment and then to use ChatGPT to help them write it, to basically try to prompt their way into a good letter. And we asked students, okay, now that you've gone through this, what do you think? What are the upsides and downsides of doing this? What are the core weaknesses that you've noticed? So about 47 students did this. They answered open-ended questions. And we answered data using thematic analysis. And what we found was that students they felt that it was good at writing templates for them. So this standard writing, this templated writing, like a job letter or like a letter for a job, it's a fairly standard piece of writing. It was good at giving them that structure, but they found that what was generated was actually boring. Like it took away a part of themselves when they did. It enhanced their professionalism. So some students, some were ELLs, for example, or not necessarily strong writers. It gave them the language to write professionally, or how they thought it needed to be professional. But again, they found that this personal touch was lost. One of the things that it did do that was just net good was that when prompted, we were able to, ChatGPT basically prompted students to integrate their personal experiences more deeply into the letter, right? So one of the things that we had them do was, list some sort of activity that you think is important to you and how it relates to this job. Sometimes students wouldn't necessarily be able to connect those dots as well. So it was able to sort of encourage them to think in those ways. But at the end of the experience, interestingly, students still thought they could just do better on their own. And this was for a couple of reasons. One was some students who were stronger writers thought that it just took too long. Other students felt that it was just a poor use of time to constantly basically keep poking at ChatGPT to improve writing over and over. That process of iteration wasn't efficient. It wasn't actually helping them become better writers. For instructors, when we're thinking about how we can use them as instructors, how we can use generative AI tools, one of the things, at least the current state of the technology, is that it's not that great at planning lessons. Like if you tell it to, plan me a 40-minute lesson on a topic, it's not that good at it. Moreover, if the data that it's used, going back to that Elmer's glue example, if the data that it's using to help plan your lesson is biased, it's just going to give you a biased lesson. Now, luckily, we're in a position where we have our expertise to sort of mitigate, delete things that are incorrect. But if we're thinking about later down the line or scaling, or sometimes if you're overburdened, you might not catch things. On average, the training data that exists out in the wild, right? So you're thinking about things like ChatGPT, or not like Teachers Pay Teachers, or just other places where instructional content exists. The data just isn't that great. Generative AI tools are currently not good at grading, but they're good at reading. right? Though they might notice things that you don't notice in the writing that you've given it and give you another way to engage with it. It probably isn't a surprise to anyone, but generative AI tools are surprisingly bad at math. If we think back to our quick example or just how large language models work, that sort of on the face of it makes sense because ChatGPT isn't trying to do math, it's trying to give you an answer that sounds good. And sometimes incorrect answers sound good. So that's what it'll give you. Over the past couple of weeks, some more news has come out when we're thinking about AI detectors, right? This idea that, well, we might be able to use an AI detector to just find when students are using it. But so this was a study that Bloomberg did. They basically, and they anchor the study with the story of a student, that the challenge with AI detectors is that none of them are foolproof. And even the ones that operate at like 99% efficiency, where they will only incorrectly identify one student, that's still consequential, right? When you go to a student and you say your writing is inauthentic and AI generated, that has consequences for that student. And the challenge is that all you can do is accuse the student, and at least currently at many policies that I've reviewed say that the burden of proof is on the instructor, and the evidence of the AI detector is insufficient to say that it actually was written by AI. So effectively, you're negotiating with your student to have a conversation with them about admitting to it, because then that will be evidence. So that entire process can actually be very harmful to students. The other study that's worth mentioning here that the Bloomberg cites is that AI detectors can be biased against non-native English writers for a couple of reasons. One is, if you're learning a language, there's a very strong chance you will find all the standard examples of that language to help improve your writing. Like, that's what you will try to do. That language, unfortunately, mirrors exactly what AI would do. So you might get flagged as a false positive. So you can it's sort of this idea of using Grammarly, but if you're using something like ChatGPT, it's going to change your language. Your writing is going to basically mimic what generative AI would output anyway. One thing to note here is that even though this is a fairly newish study, the generative AI tool that they looked at was ChatGPT 3.5, so it's an older tool. Chances are this will likely be less. This is, I feel like, a solvable problem that won't be necessarily the case anymore, but we should still be mindful of that. Now, I want to get into, if for staff people, or if you work with staff people, sort of this idea of efficiency. Because often that's one of the things that gets touted as what AI is really good for, is making us more efficient. I think that there can be sort of some insidious problems here, like when we're thinking about this idea of AI can do it, then maybe I don't need to hire for it. That might actually introduce this idea that I'm calling a phantom efficiency, where it sounds like it's creating less work, but it actually downstream creates more work. Gen AI content might not align with your strategic vision. So remember, wherever we're engaging with a large language model, we're effectively ceding some of our agency over to a model that has made a number of decisions for us. And those might not align with whatever our strategic vision is, which is, again, creates more downstream work for us. It introduces an implicit obligation that we need to check the work, right? So that's where the work comes. It might not be on the front end. You might not actually have to create the thing or create the artifact, but you still need to check it. And that actually ends up being a fair bit of work, depending on how comfortable you are. I also think that we're not necessarily going to be in the world in 5 to 10 years where everyone's a prompt engineer. So we shouldn't be training prompt engineers. We should just be training people who are critical thinkers of whatever it is they're producing. But that said, there are core benefits. So in the context of education, Gen AI can scale quickly and broadly. I think scaling is a positive. Personalization is good. So assuming good data, and that's an important assumption here. Gen AI tools can personalize content to fit a particular need. Automation. So some mundane, low impact or low important tasks can be offloaded, enabling more professional development. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to constrict our workforce as a result of that, right? Core downsides are bias. Vanilla Gen AI models are trained on the internet. So you saw 2 examples of why that's a bad thing. But one thing that I think it's important is that bias is a perspective. So it's not inherently bias as a concept isn't inherently bad. It's just what sort of bias do we want? So if we could bias the model using our own like good instructional content, that's fine because we've at least controlled what's biased about it. There's privacy, there's a black box effect. So we don't know who has our data, how it's processed, how it's being used to train and create more products. And then there's this idea of over-reliance or phantom efficiency. So there's this, current models are limited, and one of the things that we need to think about is how expertise is being developed or underdeveloped when we start offloading too many tasks to generative AI tools. So I think that one of the things that I find is important when we're thinking about generative AI tools is this idea of understanding our own values when we're making decisions about any Gen AI tool. So folks here may or may not be familiar with the trolley problem. So who here is familiar with it, just out of curiosity? About a quarter of us. So what effectively does the trolley problem? Well, I'll just go through it because that's enough of you where it's fun to go through. So the idea here is if you are standing on train tracks, right? It's dated. It's an old thought experiment. And you have a decision to make. This train is barreling down towards potentially running, well, not potentially, it is going to run over and kill these five people. You are standing on the switch where if you decide, I can act, I can flip the switch, divert the train, but it's still going to kill that one person. So what this is forcing us to do is to decide whether or not acting is moral or not acting is moral. So in philosophy, this introduces us to two ways of thinking about ethics: deontology and consequentialism. So I guess by show of hands, who would pull the lever? I'm going to make you choose. Only two people? Wow, you guys like rules. Three people, okay. So I've been in rooms where everyone's like, I would 100% pull that lever. And the reason for it is because what values you bring to the table dictates what decision is important to you. So if you're a consequentialist, well, you just do the, quote unquote, do the math. And often people will just say that, I just did the math. Fewer people die. But other folks, if you have the sense of moral duty, then you don't want to be the cause of the death, right? By pulling that lever, you are that link in that causal chain. So you've caused it. And I'm not here to say one is correct or one is incorrect. What I'm here to do is to push folks to just think about that problem. And in a second, to think about what that problem means for generative AI and generative AI use, right? So if you're a deontologist, no action, I will not cause a death. If you're a consequentialist, you'll say, I will sacrifice one to save many. This matters for how we think about ethics and AI. So generative AI is a tool that we can think about it from a deontological perspective, where we would say, for example, that generative AI should be designed and deployed in ways that respect human autonomy, where there's 100% transparency, and if it doesn't check at least those two boxes, I will not engage in using the tool, regardless of all the positives that are associated with that tool's use. You could also think about this as a consequentialist, which is I want to automate routine tasks. I want to have improved efficiency because these things over here don't matter as much. As long as I get to do more work, I get to do more good, right? So that's just another way of thinking about it. And those are actually decisions that you make whether or not you think about it when you decide to adopt or not adopt a given piece of technology. Your values are inherent in that decision. So one of the things that I think is important here when we're thinking about how this plays out in the market is, I don't know, this is they've been around for a year or so now. Iron Learning, I think it's pronounced. So if you haven't heard of them, you might soon, because they are a new edtech startup that was founded by an ex-Google exec. He was at Google for about 17 years. He's got a lot of investors sort of interested. I'm not here to badmouth this company. That's just one example. And I talked to him like a few weeks ago, last week, so it's fine. But there's a lot of venture capital here. And there was a panel where we asked, where he was basically on the hot seat. And if you're familiar with the book Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble, she was the one asking him the hard questions. And one of the questions was, well, why you? Why do we need a for-profit solution for AI when we can sort of either develop these technologies on our own? Like, what is it about Silicon Valley that wants to solve this problem of education? And he gave answers, like he could sort of give the standard answers. But I was in the audience and I was going to be on a panel after that. And one of the things that I wanted to really think through, I'm like, okay, he's giving answers, but what are his actual, what's in writing? Because I think that's what's important. Like, what does this company actually say is their policy or their terms of service? So before I get into a couple examples that we should all be mindful of is the Chiron Learning is structured as a B Corp, as a public benefits corporation. So this was a new concept to me. But the idea behind a B Corp is they also, outside of protect it, like serving their shareholders and investors, they have to say that they also provide some sort of public good. Which is, so the B Corps that you might be familiar with are Kickstarter, if you've ever Kickstarted a thing, or one of the REI, I believe, like that has its employees actually own a piece of the company, right? These are public good corporations. So Chiron Learning is structured as a B Corp, the idea being that they can provide some sort of public good. I looked and I actually don't know which public good they say they're going to provide, so I'll keep looking. But this is how they position themselves. They want to create and deliver engaging online courses at a fraction of the time and cost, right? So notice the language here that I think is important, right? Build anything from, well, just build things, right? From a 10-minute presentation to a 10-week interaction. So here we have sort of the telltale language of someone who cares about efficiency and might be thinking more from a consequentialist perspective. When I dug into their terms of service, there are three things I want to highlight that I think are important when we're thinking about these questions. One is they provide sort of beta services. If you've ever sort of been on any of these new web apps, so sometimes they'll roll out new features in beta form. And the idea here is like we're testing something new. We don't know if we like it yet. We need to get more user data to see if it works or not. That's perfectly fine. Like you get to play with something new. That's interesting. They get to develop it. But one of the things that they also do is they divorce themselves from any liability when you use that thing, right? They say if something goes wrong, it is your problem. So we again see that even though they're meant to sort of, and I don't want to sort of say this as a total negative. I understand, right? If you're trying something as from the company's perspective, if you're doing something new, you don't necessarily want to absorb all of that liability, but it is a choice to offload all of that liability onto the user and say, if something goes wrong, it's yours, or nothing will happen. The other thing that is in their terms of service is that because this is a platform for educators where you can create lessons, you can create like a 10-minute presentation or like a 10-week course, you still get to own all of it. That's your content, but they get to transmit, store, but they also get to modify and create derivative works of it. Now, normally this wouldn't be like something I care too much about, but if we think about what generative AI is, it's literally a derivation engine. Like you create derivatives of work through Gen AI. So you're effectively what's sort of buried in here is we will use your data to train our new models so that eventually we can sort of make our product better. But again, your data is what's enabling that. Whether or not that's problematic for you, that's a decision that I think departments have to make or individuals have to make whenever they opt into these services. This is sort of standard, I guess, nowadays, where if something goes wrong, you basically agree to arbitration as opposed to being a member of a class that can litigate. So again, sort of offloading some of that liability onto the user. So I wanted to end here because when we go back to thinking about our values when it comes to generative AI, we do make these decisions about whether or not we want to operate in ways that are more rule governed or ways that are more focused on consequences. So whenever you're thinking about your courses or what students are doing, I think it's important for us to reflect on the language that we're using when we're positioning these tools as tools. Because again, at the beginning of my talk, I gave you a couple of ways to think about it. As soon as the tool becomes embedded in your everyday practice, you start to think through it, and it ceases to be a tool that is just a tool. It's the way you interact with the world. So when we're telling our students to use, or when we're using generative AI, and full disclosure, I've used ChatGPT to shape text all the time. Like it's fine, but I do it knowing how and when I'm doing it and for what purpose. And there's some writing I preserve, like I don't want them to touch, and there's some writing I like emails or like some boilerplate text. I'm like, I don't want to like read how to write that. You tell me what that form is, and I'll edit it. I feel like that's okay. But it's a personal decision that I've made. So one of the things I push audiences to think about is what are the decisions that are in front of you and in front of your students? What values are you bringing to the table when you're making those decisions? And what are the downstream implications of those decisions on learning, instruction, and student motivation? Because one of the things that is important, and that I highlighted just very briefly when I talked about the study with students, is that students know that there's a day coming when entry-level positions are going to be harder for them to get because they're going to be offloaded to AI. We're making those decisions. They're not. So it's important for us to really think through what we're training our students to do, what the implications of these future technologies are for them, and how we're responding to that. So that's it. Happy to take questions.
A little bit after 4 o'clock, so why don't we do Stephen another?